Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Bob Scarborough.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys, fighting for truth, justice, and the fair tax way.
That's exactly right. And I get excited about our programs, being a part of it, and thinking here at the Christmas season about Ron Malero and his recent passing, and big shoes to fill on my part. But it's exciting because we get an opportunity to meet with you every week, folks, and talk about the fair tax. And you need to invite people over the next several weeks, because coming up in February, we're going to be at CPAC down in Florida, and you can join us. The invitation is open. You can make it down there. We'll have the FAIRtax 500. That's the number we're shooting for, 500 people in FAIRtax garb talking about the fair tax at CPAC. And we'll have more information on that as the weeks progress here.
All right. And we've got part two of our interview with economist David Kendall coming up here in just a second on FAIRtax Power Radio. And then for the next couple of weeks, we've got some more candidate pledges. John Gaber has gotten us another one out there in Texas. Now, they've been redistricting out in Texas. So some in Texas District 8 and some in Texas 2. And John has been himself redistricted over into, Texas 2. But he's going to be working on candidates out there from both of those districts. He has another one that you're going to be talking to shortly. It should be a really interesting guy to talk to. He's from Uganda.
Absolutely. And he's a big fair tax supporter. Signed the pledge with John not too long ago, and we'll be catching up and interviewing him for the show here very shortly.
Okay, since we've been talking to Professor Kendall, we'll be talking to fair tax interviews for the next couple of weeks. We got to sneak in. I can't go much farther without at least one little quick look at Congress.gov.
Oh, please go right ahead.
This will be really quick because we want to get into this second part of the David Kendall interview. But HR 6068 to amend the Internal Revenue Code to include publication of written news articles as a tax-exempt purpose for organizations. Translate that, the New York Times wants tax-exempt status.
It's going to be an interesting time until we can swerve into the reality of the fair tax and the benefits in our pocketbook, but also in the crazy stuff that goes on in Congress.
Oh, yes. And our year-end show, we do this every year. This will be your first year doing this. I have been compiling some of the craziest things that we found on Congress.gov all through the entire year. We're going to go through the 2021 Tax Proposal Hall of Shame on our last program of the season, which I believe will be the 28th of December.
Yes.
But moving along real quickly, this is almost in conjunction with the first one, HR 6045, to amend the Internal Revenue Code to provide for a tax credit for newspaper subscriptions. I guess the newspaper lobbyists have been busy this past week.
That are the timber companies as well, because, hey, if you have I guess it could be digital, but I mean, if they're talking about having a paper delivered, think of all the benefits of making sure that you would still be able to hold the newspaper in your hand. Mm-hmm. Does anybody do that anymore? I know a couple of people here.
I know a few that do, yeah. So I know some people that have bird cages that need newspaper.
Wrapping fish.
I couldn't resist that. But I tell you what, we'll be looking at the Tax Proposal Hall of Shame here in a few weeks on FAIRtax Power Radio. But for now, let's get back into our interview with David Kendall. If you missed last week's program, that was part one. You can go back to FAIRtaxGuys.com and catch part one. But here we go with part two of our interview with David Kendall. Let's roll it. Okay, let me ask you to break out your crystal ball here for a second. The Biden administration, they've got big plans for the IRS. The current administration, they want to vastly increase the budget, hire a new army, of agents and auditors, engage in an unprecedented level of spying on the activity of people's bank accounts. Now, assume all of that gets enacted. What's the result?
Wow. That is a hard one to answer, Bob, because we know the general direction that will go. We know that it will not be a good thing. That will not be good. Mm-hmm. Okay. We know that the most recent foray into all this, which was a trial balloon that got floated by the administration and pretty quickly got shot down so vehemently that they backed off of it, was the notion that the IRS should be able to track as little input or output of $600 from individual bank accounts.
Yeah, that
was insane. just a few weeks ago. Well, my goodness, This past tax season, I had an issue. I used TurboTax. I try to minimize my cost of compliance, and I try to do my taxes myself and have for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's getting harder and harder, but we had an issue with TurboTax, and I tried for days to be in touch with the IRS, tried to get them on the phone. Impossible. It was impossible. Okay, because they're so overwhelmed with all of the complications brought about by the COVID pandemic and all the payments that they were being asked to make on behalf of the Congress and so forth. You could not actually get a hold of a person. Okay, so now imagine that the big plans of the Biden administration go forward, and the IRS gets tens more billions of dollars to try to implement more audits, more intrusion into people's financial affairs. How's that going to go? Oh my goodness.
Not good.
It will not be good. Mistakes will be made. You'll get a letter from the IRS that says, we've determined that you owe this much money. If you'd like to protest, call this number. And you'll call that bleeding number, and you'll get an answering tree.
Mm-hmm. And
telephone tree.
Absolutely.
And you may die before, from sheer frustration. It'll be such, oh my goodness.
I heard a stat once that said you have 1 chance in 50 of even getting to a real person. And they have what they call these courtesy disconnects, which means they hang up on you and just don't want to talk to you.
I can't believe you've even got a chance of 1 in 50, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I don't remember where I heard that stat, but I did.
The implications for the American people and for just ordinary folks who are doing the best they can to comply with the tax laws that exist, and nobody knows. There is no person, including the IRS. You cannot rely on information you are given directly by a representative of the IRS. You cannot rely on it. Why? Because the bleeding thing is so complex, so complicated, that there is no one who even has the right answers.
Right.
Even according to what the laws say.
You hear a lot of people. Go ahead. I said you hear a lot of people saying that the solution to the problem you just raised is a flat tax. That we can get rid of the IRS. We could do our tax returns on a postcard if we just had a flat tax. Again, from a professional economist point of view, will a flat tax fix the problem?
It will not, because there's several reasons why it will not. As you no doubt know, the original federal income tax code was a flat tax.
Mm-hmm.
And it supposedly was only going to apply to individuals that were the so-called 1%ers of today's jargon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a single, there might have been 2 different rates as I think back, but it was essentially a flat tax. It was nothing like we have today. As it's been said by any number of people who have been advocates of the fair tax and who know anything at all about taxation, a flat tax simply won't stay flat, just for openers. But now let me do go in the direction of glazing a few eyes over here into the economic theory aspect of it. If you're going to have an income tax, you have to be able to define what is income.
Makes sense.
And you have to be able to measure what is income. None of that is straightforward. It sounds straightforward because most people's income just comes from their paycheck. I mean, how many millions of people have no other source of income but their weekly or bi-weekly or monthly paycheck? Millions and millions fall into that category. So from man on the street, the notion of, well, income, that's easy. That's what I get paid. Well, guess what? It's not easy at all. And we're seeing here, again, recently, in a couple of weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's still not completely gone away, the administration and its minions were floating the idea of taxing unrealized capital gains.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means you own a stock and you didn't sell it, but at the end of the calendar year, its value had gone up in the marketplace, let's say by $100. Guess what? The idea is we're going to tax you on that $100. What?
Yeah, $100 you have on paper. You don't have it in your hand.
The mind reels. Okay. But from an economic theoretic standpoint, there are people who say, yeah, that's income. Well, one of the great virtues of the fair tax is it's not hard to define when you spend $1 on a good or service.
Mm-hmm.
You hand $1 over to whoever's selling it to you. It's easy to see that a purchase has been made, and the person who sold you whatever it is going to be asked to pay that sales tax. The fair tax is a sales tax, essentially. It's a national retail sales tax is the proposal. So one of the huge problems with any income tax, whether it's flat or not flat, is the whole measurement issue and the definition, the very definition itself of which dollars do we count as income. It's a much more serious problem than most people could even imagine.
All right, well, let's bypass that problem by
I
thinking.
see the eyes glazing now, but
you hear some people also talking about a European-style value-added tax, which is a consumption tax. It's not an income tax. Will that fix the problem?
It could, but, and it's a huge, it's a significantly huge issue. Of course, most of the European countries do have a value-added tax.
Mm-hmm.
They also have income taxes.
Yeah, that's the big problem. We do not want a consumption tax on top of an income tax.
I can remember quite well when I was an undergraduate student majoring in economics at North Carolina State University, and first learned about the notion of a value-added tax. Light bulbs went off in my head. I said, well, my goodness, see, because I'd already been in the Navy for 4 years before I got to go to college. So I wasn't a traditional age student. I already had been paying taxes for a while.
Yeah.
And filing my own limited, didn't have very much income, but it was still a pain in the neck even then. Even if you file 1040, form 1040 is a bleeding pain in the neck, for goodness sake. Anyway, so I had some experience with taxation. So when I first learned about a value-added tax, and I said, well, this is really great. This is really a great idea, because a value-added tax, we can't go into the details of a value-added tax, but it's really kind of cool. Just trust me. As a tax specialist, a guy who teaches this stuff, let me tell you, it's really kind of cool. It's hard to avoid paying the tax.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't pass the tax on at each stage of the production chain as goods and services are produced, you end up getting to pay the tax. Well, you don't want to do that. So it's sort of self-enforcing. So I thought this was so cool. And then I realized, of course, of being taught, this is a consumption-based tax. It's not an income-based tax. Well, I would venture to say that at least 80, if not 90% of all professional economists who have any knowledge of the theory of taxation at all will agree with me that a consumption-based tax is superior in many ways, beneficial in many ways compared to an income tax. Well, we won't go down that rabbit hole. Just you'll have to raise your right hand and say, I believe, I trust you, I believe you. But it is true. Okay. So I was very excited about a value-added tax when I was an undergraduate at NC State. Well, then later on, by the time I became a professor of economics at the University of Virginia, I began to realize more about, well, all that will really happen if we're not really careful here is we'll have both an income tax if we adopted a value-added tax.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as far as I know, there has never been a serious proposal for a federal level value-added tax in the United States. It gets talked about every once in a while, but so far we've been able to dodge that bullet.
Yeah, of course, so, again, one of the beauties of the fair tax is it's contingent upon repealing the 16th Amendment.
Well, and that, at some point, we are bound to get around to talking about, well, surely the fair tax is not a silver bullet, is it? I mean, it surely must have some disadvantages and drawbacks, doesn't it? And that's one of them. From my perspective, at the very least, when people ask me, do you support the fair tax? I say, well, yes, I do. And I have for many years. And if you've got time, I'll explain why. And then people say, well, the objection finally comes around, well, will the 16th Amendment be repealed? You're wanting the Congress to pass the fair tax? And to be honest with you, Bob, I don't. Unless what?
Yeah.
Unless the 16th Amendment is repealed first, not after. First. Why? Well, because I'm an old man. I'm 72 years old. I've been fogging a mirror on this planet for a long enough time to understand perfectly well that if the 16th Amendment is not abolished first, we'll not have it abolished at all. And we will have then what? Both a national retail sales tax and a mandatory income tax. I believe that. Oh, I would, if I saw that coming, I would switch teams immediately. I feel that strongly about it. I would have to say, I no longer support the fair tax. Can't do it. Won't do it. Can't do it. I'll argue against it. Why? Because we will end up with both. That's why. So that's, to me, that's the chief obstacle, really, of that we folks who would like to see the fair tax become the replacement for the current federal income tax code. That's the Achilles heel. Can we get rid of the 16th Amendment? Can that be repealed? Well, we know how difficult it is to pass a constitutional amendment. That is not easy.
Nope. It's by design not easy.
Well, indeed. It's a good thing it's not easy. Look at what has happened over the many years now with the ERA. People that may not even know what that means, the Equal Rights Amendment that was proposed so many, many years ago. I'm not a specialist in that, but just having hung around and paying attention once in a while, I know that it has never been ratified.
Yeah, it died. The 7 years expired.
And there's some people who are saying, well, it can be revived and all that. Well, my goodness, if you think for a minute, how many people just in general would have been in favor of the ERA, just general population, say, no, that's okay, I don't mind that, compared to how many people will be in favor of eradicating or repealing the 16th Amendment? Well, I'd be easily able to say, at least in my mind, I would have thought there would be an order of magnitude more people who would be okay with the ERA than repealing. Because, Bob, what happens is when I start talking to folks about this notion of mandatory taxation being a really serious problem, and I'm a proponent of something we don't have time to talk about today, but people, if they are interested in it, can read a book that I've wrote a few years ago or talk about it a little bit and get more ideas about the notion of voluntary taxation. But mandatory taxation, even though it's the real problem, but most people will tell you, well, we have to have it. We have to have it. We can't abolish the income tax. How could we abolish the federal income tax? Because then the federal government wouldn't be able to do what I want them to do. So can the 16th Amendment actually be repealed? What do you think?
It's going to take some doing, but I think it can be done when people realize that the replacement for the income tax is going to be so much better than the income tax. That kind of makes me, I want to move along here a little bit. You remember that the the fair tax was the brainchild of a team of economists that were hired by these businessmen in Houston in the mid-90s. They were given a blank sheet of paper and says, design me the very best tax system you possibly can that is revenue neutral, i.e. brings in the same amount of money as the income tax. Now, in your opinion as a professional economist, how good a job did they do? Can you think of anything they missed or could have done better?
You know, nothing springs to mind. Okay. There are some nitpicky issues that we have neither the time nor do actually have the recall to pick those nits that we might talk about. But in general, I think they did a very good job. I don't have nothing springs to mind. I don't have a specific thought, well, if they'd only do this, why that would improve the fair tax legislation that's been essentially, as far as I know, now you may know better, as far as I know, it's essentially the same bill that has been introduced in Congress for each of the last, how many years? You know, I don't.
First introduced in 1999, over 20 years ago. All right, let me kind of wrap things up here with one more question for you. You say you had 80 very well-known, distinguished economists sign on to your letter back in 2005 with you. Do you have an opinion on why the panel just kind of blew you all off and didn't make any accepting your recommendations? Did they already have the predetermined outcome they wanted, and they just weren't going to listen to anything else?
Well, you have to look who was on the panel. Who was on the panel?
I don't know.
Mostly politicians.
Okay.
I mean, let's face it. The people who have the vested interest in the federal income tax code being what it is, we didn't get here accidentally. We didn't get to where we are with federal income taxation by accident. We got there on purpose. Okay, those people are the same people who were on that commission that got us there in the first place. Let's just be honest. Let's be straightforward about it. They do not want to give up the control of the tax code and the ability to line their own pockets, line the pockets of their friends, empty the pockets of their non-friends, tell other people what they have to do, when they have to do it, and how much of it they have to do. None of it do they want to give up. So I put in a video that I made, it's available on YouTube, which is I think a link also available in Steve's a weekly letter to that. Politicians will have to be drug kicking and screaming to passage of the fair tax. It will literally have to be a groundswell effort where people like me, and I do this, tell their district congressman, if you don't favor the fair tax, I don't vote for you, period.
Yep, that'll do it.
It's that simple. And unless we have millions of voters, just like you and me, telling our representatives, I'm not supporting you if you don't come out and say, I support fair tax, because that's what it will take.
Yep, that's what we've been trying to do here for the past 6 years on FAIRtax Power Radio on a weekly basis.
Indeed. And people probably ask you this too. They certainly ask me, do I think the fair tax will ever be passed? And I say, I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely. And then they say, well, why do you support it then if you don't think it's likely? Because a lot of the economists that I asked to sign the letter, you know what they told me? That they didn't want to sign it. They said, this can't happen, David. What's the point? That's what they said. And what I always tell people who ask me that question is, I say, I continue to support the fair tax proposal, not because I think it's likely to ever be passed, but because it's the right thing.
All right. Well, I surely appreciate the time you had talking with us today. This has been quite enlightening. In fact, we're going to split this over 2 FAIRtax Power Radio episodes. And again, Professor David Kendall, University of Virginia, appreciate your efforts and on behalf of the FAIRtax, appreciate your time talking to us today.
Bob, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And there we have it. Interesting thought on the 16th Amendment, wasn't it?
And and it's a challenge. A lot of people go 16th Amendment. How do you get rid of that? You can't just flip a switch and it be gone. It's really really incredible.
Well, it's a 7-year process to get it ratified once it's been sent out to the states for ratification, and it takes a 2/3. I think it's a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress to propose a constitutional amendment. So it's going to be kind of a tough road to hoe to get rid of that thing. He's the only one I've heard in quite a while that said we need to get rid of the 16th Amendment first before implementing the fair tax. I'm not sure I agree with that, because I believe that if you implement the fair tax and you start a 7-year clock ticking, folks are, after just a short time of getting their entire paycheck, getting the prebate every month, not having to file income tax returns anymore, once they enjoy all of the great things the fair tax is going to do for them, and then you tell them, well, wait a minute, we've got to repeal the 16th Amendment if you want to keep this, I think that's going to be done in fairly quick order.
I believe that too. And folks will have at that point, and you have folks like John Gaver in Texas, who is seeking out not only the currently seated congressmen, but also people who are candidates that are running. The mindset, as we have seen over the last several months, is changing with regard to not only the fair tax, but some sort of reform in our Congress at the national level. And I think people are going to be in a position, once the fair tax is enacted, it'll be as easy as making sure that the elected officials know. And I think they'll already be there. I think the mindset will already be there. A fair tax mindset is going to be there regardless. Once the fair tax is enacted, the folks in Congress are going to realize, we can't. It'll be totally different. The mindset will be totally different from the culture that's there now in Washington.
Yeah, we got to give Gaver a shout out. He's trying to do the same thing out there in Texas that we did in Florida 3 this past time around when Ted Yoho retired. We got if I'm not mistaken, we got every Republican candidate in the Republican primary for Florida 3 to sign the fair tax pledge. So regardless of who won the primary, then we're going to have a fair tax candidate in the general election. And I would encourage people not to be discouraged if you've got a lot of Democrats running. I mean, Democrats like money too. I mean, how they would enjoy not getting any withholding from their paycheck. So even though the Democratic leadership has been fairly hostile to the fair tax, we could probably win over some rank and file Democrats. So don't let that deter you.
Well, the current climate in Washington is volatile, to say the least. And inside volatility can come great change in a positive direction if the process is handled properly.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking the fair tax is as good a choice as anything right now, the best opportunity in the midst of all the turmoil that's going on at our nation's capital politically. I think we have an opportunity to move it forward.
I sure hope so, but we got to move this FAIRtax Power Radio episode on out of here. We're slap out of time again. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Bob Scarborough.
The Fair Tax Guys, again, reminding you that the fair tax is the only truly fair tax, and once you understand it,
you will demand it.
So what would you do for her?
Well, we've got several programs that will help her. We just need to find out how much she makes. But the good news is, the less she does, the more we can help.
Yeah.
If I may, with the fair tax, we wouldn't even tax her income. So the more she makes, the more she has.
But still, a consumption tax could eat up a lot of her income.
Which is why at the beginning of every month, we're actually going to give back all that she pays in taxes on basic necessities.
You're going to give her back her taxes?
Every month, on everything taxed on basic necessities. But we're also going to give it back to you and to every American citizen.
Why?